wide disparity between the schools of thought in this one. Well, those schools of, if we're talking about what, Paul is intending, what's important to Paul and what he's writing about here, this is it. And he is addressing this topic. And we need to interpret the verses as such. And so we're going to read some things that we honestly make some pretty, we draw a line in the sand with some of the things that we write here, and they're maybe tangential to what Paul's primary topic is here. And so, the thing that the Corinthians wrote to Paul, it wasn't that they were asking what are the acceptable practices of divorce and remarriage. That's not the main topic. And the main topic is whether or not husbands and wives have to be completely separated, that to be acceptable to God, that they're not intimate with one another. And so that's the topic here. And I think all of this can be kind of summarized in a general principle. Oh, but before I get to that, I think there are two solutions that Paul handles here that these people posited. Because, first he's saying, that a husband and wife, even though that they're married, that they completely abstain from being together. That's number one. And then number two, the solution is that, you just divorce that spouse. And so, you as a Christian, you're better on your own. And so, just divorce them and live a celibate life. And so two solutions to that I think Paul addresses. And I think all of this is discussing the specifics. And then when we get to kind of verse 17, Paul kind of expands his focus to the general rule here. And that quote there is, nevertheless to each one as the Lord distributed to him, and each one as God called him, let each one walk thusly. And so you have this idea that they're trying to enforce this rule that you have to sort of change your status. Like a married person has to act like an unmarried person, or an unmarried person then has to get married and act like a married person, or all of these other different kind of statuses and ways of life. But Paul ultimately is saying that you don't have to change your current status to be more acceptable. And primarily this is affecting marriage in the context, but then he widens that scope, and this can affect a much wider range of topics, and Paul is going to address that as well. And so when we read this is really a bigger thing than just divorce and remarriage throughout here. So that's what I'm wanting to kind of set down before we talk about any of this. Any thoughts on that? Okay. So that is the thing that they wrote. So here's Paul's sort of first response to that. So, but because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. And so he says, because of sexual immorality. Now, what Paul's not saying here is that marriage exists simply because people can't control themselves. That's not what he's saying. Marriage is part of God's design. It's part of his design. And so because of that design, I would say that people have a natural drive for companionship. That's just part of our DNA, so to speak. And so he then says, let each man have his own wife and let each woman have her own husband. We use the word let a little bit differently. Let here is actually a command. It's kind of a linguistic thing, or a grammar thing actually, that doesn't really get that translated into English. And so what people typically do is that they use the word let to indicate that this is a command in the third person. And so let each man, or a command to each man to have his own wife, and command each woman to have her own husband. And that's still a command, but it's not so much that it's this universal command to marry, but it is a command for a person to marry if they cannot otherwise commit, that if they remain separate, if they remain single, that they will otherwise commit immorality, sexual immorality, then they should marry, that they're obligated to marry, because it would be better to be in that situation than to sin. And so that is a command to get married if you cannot have that level of self-control. And so he also commands that each person to have their own spouse. And so people should be committed to their spouse completely and only to their spouse. And so as part of, helping out with this problem that people have, that is the solution, to be completely committed just to one spouse there. And so basically he's saying this idea of what the Corinthians are saying, that you have to be completely separated from a spouse. Don't even touch them, basically. That's not the right frame of reference. It's not the right frame of function. There's bad things that happen when we try to go against that. Any other thoughts here? Okay. Yes.
Verse 6, it relates, it says, but I say this is a concession.
Right.
As a commandment. In the Greek, what is, how do they differentiate those two?
Okay. I'm trying to remember what the word for concession is. So let me try to roll that around in my brain for another 5 minutes before I get to that verse. But I don't remember that exact word.
As far as English, let's say that.
Okay. Let me get there in a second then. So let's get to that verse first. So any other thoughts there? Okay. So let me just also kind of take as an aside how thrilled I am to get to talk about this topic today. So verse 3. So let the husband render obligation to the wife, then likewise also the wife to the husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife. Do not withdraw from one another, except out of harmony for a season, so that you may devote yourself to prayer, and again may be upon the same, so that Satan may not tempt you through your lack of self-control. And so there is a reason, this acceptable outlet for companionship between husbands and wives. And so as a married couple, let the husband render obligation to the wife. There is a debt. There is a duty. That's what that obligation is. There is something owed about being a husband, and there are certain things that a husband owes a wife, and there are certain things that a wife owes a husband. And so And so that obligation has to be fulfilled, and that's part of the design of marriage. And I think that it's important that here that Paul goes through great lengths to not just say, well, the wife has these duties to the husband, period, end of sentence. But yet all of the things here, Paul doesn't even imply, but he makes it very, very plain that he says husbands have an obligation to wives and wives have an obligation to other. And so for this reason of immorality, there is this obligation. And so spouses also don't have authority just for themselves. And so the wife doesn't have authority over her own body. The husband doesn't have authority over his own body. No spouse has sole authority over their body. And the main thing that's being said here is that, the husband and wife are one body, and so their decisions, they don't affect each one of them alone. When a husband makes a decision about himself, then that decision doesn't affect just himself, but it affects his spouse. When a wife makes a decision about herself, that doesn't affect just herself, but it affects her spouse. And so whenever either spouse makes a decision like that, they have to realize that they don't just have authority over themselves, but yet there is this marriage that combines both of them, and that decision affects their spouse just as much as it affects them. And that needs to be something that they consider when they make such a decision, okay? And so like I say, Paul calls out both husband and wife in all of this. And so then the conclusion, do not withdraw from one another, except out of harmony for a season, so that you may devote yourself to prayer, and again may be upon the same, so that Satan may not tempt you through your lack of self-control. And so then the conclusion, since no one has sole authority, since there is an obligation between husbands and wives, don't withdraw from one another. And that word can mean like to deprive, to even defraud. But I think the idea is a husband and wife staying apart from one another and not, being together. And that being an unnatural thing that one person decides and one other person may not necessarily consent to that, or that may not be, healthful for them. And so there's this idea that they separate, but except out of harmony, except that both of those people agree and understand that decision being made, and they consent to that decision being made. And so that they're both working for the benefit of each other on that. And so there is this harmony together. And it's only for a season. And so that shouldn't be something that's permanent. That shouldn't be a permanent decision between the two. And the purpose of that is so that they can devote themselves to prayer. And so the reason for that isn't to deprive a spouse of something, but yet that they would have more time to devote themselves to spiritual pursuits for a season. But then, and that they can be of that same mind, but only for a time, so that Satan may not tempt you through your lack of self-control. Because regardless of how, mentally empowered we are and spiritually empowered we have natural impulses. And there is a godly way to express those impulses. And so, but yet those impulses need to be kept in check. And we need to make sure we use that godly method of satiating those impulses, or we're going to satiate them in ways that are not healthy. Let me use an example that's less emotionally charged here. So a lot of people in this country diet. They don't like the way that they look. And so what do? They decide, I'm going to go on this crash diet so that I can, go out and on the beach and wear a swimsuit and no one's going to point and laugh at me. And so they do that, and they just say, I'm going to eat a stick of celery every single day, and that's all I'm going to eat. And that's not healthy. They're depriving themselves of food. And so they do that for a season, and they might, lose a bunch of weight and everything, but what generally happens to those people? There's just something chemically, there's something mentally, but there's something within us, a natural impulse that we've got to eat. You hear about that psychological experiment from Pavlov, and he had all those dogs, and he would ring a dinner bell for the dogs, and then they would eat, right? And so what would end up happening is that the dogs would associate that bell with food, and so he would end up just ringing the bell, and then the dogs would think food, and even if there wasn't food, the dogs would still salivate. We have a chemical and emotional need to have food in our lives. And so what happens when people diet and they go on this crash diet is that their brain still thinks, I need food. And so people for a season can do that diet, maybe lose weight or whatever. Maybe it's healthy, maybe it's not, but their brain says, I need food. And so as soon as they go off of that wagon, then they have an unhealthy attachment to food, and they just eat everything in sight. And a lot of people gain whatever weight that they lost, and they gain it all back. So my point in saying that is that people withdrawing, a husband and a wife withdrawing from one another without a mutual agreement to that can create a similar kind of thing, that we all have a natural kind of need for intimacy and a connection to one another. And if we unnaturally deprive ourselves from one another in a marriage from that can create problems. And that can create a situation where someone finds another outlet that is unhealthy and ungodly in order to satiate that desire. And so we can't do that. And so again, spouses have a responsibility for one another, and they need to have that in mind when they make those kinds of decisions. Any other thoughts on that? Yes?
I find it so interesting because I understand how we read it, I understand culturally how we read it.
Right.
But how they would have read it is so different because of how the view of men and women and men and women roles.
Right.
It's an interesting thing that it's added here because I would dare say men did not think women had a lot of say.
Right.
They didn't have a lot of say in what happened.
Right. And that kind of goes against that culture. He says that both have a say in this. Yeah, both have a say. And I'm glad you brought that up too. I'll get to you in a second, Jim. There's also another thing. I think that they lived in this very wretched society. And in some people, you could kind of argue that we live in a very wretched society today. And that how we communicate sexuality within this society can be very ungodly, very unhealthy, very demeaning, very deplorable. And so, as Christians, we don't want to participate in that, and we don't want to be associated with that. We don't want to engage and participate in that. And so the solution sometimes is that, I'm going to be just completely separated from the idea of sexuality.
Because they were living around
The solution can be a problem, but sometimes we can kind of go into the ditch the other way and create a problem as well. And so there's this happy medium that I think that is the godly answer to this. Any other thoughts? Okay. Verse 8. Okay, the concession. And so now I say this according to concession, not according to command. But I wish for all people to be as also myself. But each has his own gift from God. One indeed has thusly, but one has thusly. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain as I also. And, just because a concession to, he wants people to be like him, right? But yet he says this as a concession that there are people that cannot be like him. Paul, for whatever reason in his mind, he could control himself. He didn't need to be married. And he was able to live a healthy lifestyle as a single person. But not everybody is like that. And so he's saying this as a concession, but not as a command. Not to say, I command people to do this. And I can't remember what the word for command is here. There's a few different ones that could be used. It's either entele or parangolo. Parangolema. Parangolo is the verb. So it's one of those two words. But yet the idea is that it's not something that's imperative, but it's something that he's kind of letting a little bit of slack on, a little bit of ground on for certain situations. So that's how I seem to remember that concept, but I don't remember the word. Yes. Exactly. Yeah, advice. I like that. Yeah. And so I think he has some reasoning for this advice, which he discusses later, that there are certain, good things that can come out of being single. That you can be, you can have this singleness of mind. You don't have these distractions. He says that here within this chapter, and then later on even, that there's even just the difficulties and challenges of the world sometimes, and the persecutions that go on can make being married a challenge. And so I think he sees that and sees the things that happen to himself, and some of the choices that he made individually would be much harder if he had to worry about a wife and kids as well, And so all of that's kind of his opinion rather than the command of God. And so I think some of that is more command. Some of it is concession, some of it is opinion, but a lot of it is command. And he tries to spell it out when it's command, for sure. Any other quick thoughts before I jump in? Okay. So I say this according to concession, not according to command, but I wish also this way, and another indeed has it this way. And so each of us has our own gift. And I think the greater point that he kind of gets more in detail in verse 17 is that each of us has our own set of personal circumstances. There are some people who have certain strengths, and there are other people with different strengths. And we all can kind of endure different spiritual challenges in our own kind of way. And each of us can use those distinct circumstances to glorify God. Paul can glorify God just fine as a single guy. Somebody else may be able to glorify God as a married person. And he even goes through other links. A person could be enslaved and glorify God. A person could be, rich or poor and glorify God or whatever. Lots of different ways. You can use your set of circumstances to glorify God. You don't have to change those circumstances before you can be an effective tool for God. And so each of us has our own gift. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it's good if you remain as I also. There are benefits to having that singleness of mind. But as a concession, he understands if they do not have the self-control, then it's a command, let them marry. Let the person who is in that situation marry. For it's better to marry than to be inflamed with desire. So similarly, as the spouses who unwillfully separate themselves, that creates a problem. A person who is widowed, it would be problematic for them to unnaturally continue to be separate. And so therefore, it's better to get married than to have that desire and to unhealthily express that desire. So be married and express it in a godly way. And so, if there's no absolute command, if you're a widow, you got to stay single. If you're a widow, you've got to marry. But yet your certain set of circumstances, your heart and the things that you're strong in, just be the way that you are and you can glorify God. But just don't be in an unnatural way and put yourself at risk to sin. Any other thoughts on that one? Okay. Moving along. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, I missed you.
It's funny. Not that I ever say it.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to come out wrong, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Okay.
Because that's one of those that I hate the, it's probably the way it's translated too, but maybe it's
Uh-huh.
not. It's,
Right.
because it's like, I wish you to be like me. Well, if you can't control yourself.
Oh, right.
If you don't have to, 'cause
Yeah.
his words carry so much weight.
Yeah.
But without knowing exactly, we read what this says,
Mhm.
but that, as we know, that doesn't always, no, not only not what they said, but
Yeah.
you had the context of who they're saying it to, and
Right.
it is different. But this is one of those I always struggle with, because it's like,
Yeah.
it's better to be like me. But,
Yeah.
if you're weak,
Right. And I don't think, and it's easy to read it that way, especially if you're someone like me who's single, right? Well, if you guys can't control yourselves, I'm just going to single person up here. I'm like Apostle Paul. But it's not like that. And I think Paul is just saying we're all different. We each have our own strengths. And, one of us may be able to be the most effective Christian that we can as a single person, but yet somebody else, they can be the most effective Christian that they can as a married person. And, me as a single person, I don't have to always have these doubts in my mind. Man, I could serve God so much better if I just got married. And a married person shouldn't be sitting around and saying, my goodness, I could just glorify God so much better if I were a single person. We can each and all just say, this is what God has given me. How can I use it to best glorify God? And so it's not a better either or, it's just different,
Oh, yeah, 'cause there are definitely some things that a single person can do to glorify God that married people can't. But likewise, there's some things that only married people could do.
Right.
Because, as a married couple, you could go to a woman that's in distress. You, on the other hand,
It would be a challenge.
so great if Martin was, going to all these different women's houses to comfort them in their time of distress.
And I might be completely innocent and honest and all of that, but it could create a distraction and a disruption because people are going to say, well, I don't know about him, and it may be a bad thing. Yeah, so we each and all have our strengths. Daryl, did you have something?
You pretty well covered it.
Okay.
Either way is not a sin.
Yeah, either way is not a sin. Yeah, married is not, single is not.
The sexual desire was created by God. So we would have children.
Right. Yeah, and that desire is there. It's just that there is a God-approved way of meeting that desire. And so we just don't want to disrupt that. Any other thoughts? Okay. So that was to the widows. And verse 10, but to the ones who have married, I give orders. Not I myself, but the Lord. So not a concession here, but orders. Not orders from Paul, but from the Lord. A wife is not to be separated from a husband. But if she is separated, let her remain unmarried, or let her be reconciled with her husband. And a husband is not to send away a wife. And so, but to the ones who have married, I give orders. And so, Paul is like this word for orders, and I think that's the par angulo there, that he's like delivering a message from above, kind of like the person who's ahead of the detachment of troops, delivering the orders from like the general to those troops sort of on the front line. That's that idea of this order here. And so Paul is kind of delivering this. This is what God's expectations are, because it's one thing to remain single. I mean, there's really no command at that. But as soon as somebody gets married, there are more expectations there. You have two people who have made an oath to one another and an oath to God that they were going to stay together. And so there's more to it than that, than just a preference or an ability. You've made that oath, and you need to try to keep that oath. And remember, our context here is within people who are saying that, that you have to be completely celibate in order to be acceptable. And so also the context here is that, you should have to change your status to be more acceptable to God. And so within that idea, he says, a wife is not to be separated from a husband. In order to achieve that goal, don't do that. You made this vow, continue within that vow. But if she's done, and so just keep with that decision. Or if she wants to be reconciled, she needs to be reconciled to the person that she separated from for that purpose of being, for that reason of celibacy is not to send away a wife. That's not right. You've made that commitment and you need to stay with that commitment regardless of this idea of celibacy.
Why
Right.
they're separated.
Right.
So
That's
I
true.
look at it more in that this is what people struggle so much with, because something in life has happened.
Yeah.
And mistakes were made.
Right.
And now you come to the church, and this is the thing I think people struggle with is, well, I got all this baggage, now what do I do?
Right.
You really got all this baggage.
Yeah.
And it's, to me, what it's saying is you're okay, you're here, relationship-wise. Yes, if you've been divorced once or twice, there's life happens, and I like this because it talks about life happening. So, at such a high level that people struggle with, well, what about this and what about this? Does address the one historically, other than of course Jesus.
Right. And I want if you read these verses and that is your interpretation, so be it. That's great, and I hold nothing against you. I'm not trying to specific context that Paul isn't talking about every possible possibility position. But if this is just life happens, any specific situation, this is the remedy, we can still be friends. I think that's a lesson that we can have from Corinthians. They all had their own opinions. And so, like I say, just want to address the elephant in the room. Not that you were going there, but,
Well, I get it, because it's talking about sexual immorality.
Yeah.
And because you could, after he talks about sexual immorality, you could read into, we extrapolate things that aren't there.
Right.
Not that they're bad things, because they are good life lessons, but
Right.
it's really, it started off with sexual immorality.
Yeah.
It has gone from there.
Yeah, and I do think there is a sharp division in that. About what you wrote, And so I kind of think that kind of sets a stage for a lot of different verses. But again, my opinion, and that and $1 will get me a cup of coffee.
Answering a question,
Yeah,
you don't know exactly.
that's true.
what
We
the
don't.
question
We
was.
only know one phrase from their statement, not the whole letter that they had originally wrote.
Physical,
Right.
right? There's two philosophies, Greek philosophies that are engaged here, Stoicism and Epicureanism.
Absolutely.
And they're both involved in Corinth, a Greek city, right? And so you have this fighting in the church.
Yeah.
And what Paul here is saying is, look, you don't have to do Stoicism, you don't have to do Epicureanism. He's dealing with these philosophies that, one, any physicality is sin. Stay away from it.
Right.
Two, I can do anything because my physical world doesn't matter. It doesn't affect my spirituality. So that's, in the larger context, sometimes we apply it to stuff that it might be a stretch, it might be hard. I'm not saying it doesn't have worth. I'm not saying it shouldn't be looked at and considered in any situation. But he's dealing with a specific problem in Corinth where these people are thinking you can't be involved in the world or you could be totally involved.
I completely agree with what you're saying. I completely agree with that. And in my opinion, that context is key for our understanding this set of verses. And I think that, Paul isn't writing these universal commands for divorce, remarriage, or whatever, but he's trying to say, within this specific situation, of celibacy, live within the commitments you've already made rather than trying to change it. And I think we can't lose sight of that context. Any other thoughts? Great thought. Any other thoughts? Okay. I haven't been run out on a rail yet, so that's good. But thank you for bearing with me. And I do want to say it's important. If you think differently than what I have said there, I completely respect that. And, that's okay. And so that's, my take on it. I encourage you to pray on it and read it for yourself. And, that's the best that I can say. And so just think about that. So verse 12. But as to the rest, I myself say, not the Lord, if a certain brother has an unbelieving wife and she consents to dwell with him, let him not send her away. And if a certain wife has an unbelieving husband and he consents to dwell with her, let her not send away the husband. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified by the brother. For otherwise then, your children are unclean, but now are holy. And so, as to the rest, he's sort of, again, his kind of advice, his concession, his opinion. And so, if a certain brother has an unbelieving wife, and that word unbelieving here is literally unfaithful, apistos. And so the word for faithful is pistos. It has that alpha privative in front of it that negates what that means. It's unfaithful. I would love to translate that as unfaithful, but if I did, then that would mean something entirely different. And so we're left with unbelieving. But it's this idea of a person who lacks faith. And so if a brother has a wife and he's entered into Christianity, but yet his wife is not a believer, again with this idea of people wanting to have this good standing within the church, it's like, well, I need to ditch this unbelieving person to the curb and I can be a better Christian at that point. And I think he's saying, don't do that. Don't send this person away. If that person wants to continue, or a believing wife with an unbelieving husband, don't try to change that status to be better. It's 45 after. I didn't hear a second bell, but I think that it is. Okay, so let me wrap up with that. I want to finish this thought. And so for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified by the wife. I think that unbelieving person is in a better situation by having that. Don't go against that commitment you made just to change things just because you think that's going to make you a better Christian. And also that has an effect on the children. That these children that has that believing spouse, that's going to be a better influence on those kids than just kind of casting that spouse to the curb, and maybe the kids go with that unbelieving spouse and you're no longer that good influence on them. So I think the big umbrella, and we should get there next week, is that whatever our status is, we can use it to glorify God. We don't have to change our identity. We don't have to change whether we're educated or uneducated, rich, poor, healthy, unhealthy. We don't have to change that status to be a fruitful member of God's kingdom. And so I think that's the main point here, and I encourage you to read ahead for next week, and we'll continue there, Lord willing. Thank you so much for your comments and your attention.